Welcome to the View magazine's Rebel Justice podcast. I'm Tristan Kent. 2012 saw the abolition of a prison sentence that the then Justice Secretary Ken Clarke called a stain on our justice system, a sentence known as the Imprisonment for Public Protection, or IPP. The basic idea was that certain prisoners, on finishing their minimum sentence or tariff, would not be allowed to leave prison until a parole board deemed them no longer a risk to society. For anyone with an IPP, this turned what could have been only a relatively short sentence into a potential life sentence. One such person was Andrew Morris, who saw his initial 2-year sentence get dragged out to over a decade behind bars. Since leaving prison, Andrew's achieved a great number of accomplishments, from becoming a Prison and Probation Ombudsman, a prison reform consultant, trustee of a prisoner human rights group, and has even co-founded a political party. Andrew joins us today to discuss IPP, its impacts, and the future of prison reform. We began by discussing his early experiences campaigning for justice as a teenager.
So I had some experiences quite early on where I was exposed to what I felt was injustice with policing. And I remember friends of the family who were arrested, and in one situation there was one who was unfortunately killed in custody. And as a result of that, I became quite indignant, actually. Decided that I was going to start campaigning around deaths in custody and all that kind of thing.
You started a youth council as well, is that right?
So originally, I was working with a guy called Chris Butler. I mean, I don't want to speak for him, but he's no longer here to speak for himself. He saw something in me, and we started cobbling some stuff together. He supported me as like a mentor to do that. And originally set up the youth council. And I thought it was quite boring because we were meeting and just talking. We were talking about, meeting to talk about meetings. So that morphed into what is now actually still going today as the Lambeth Tigers Football Club. Because we felt that trying to get young people engaged through sport was the way forward. And I'm really happy because when Chris and I started the Lambeth Tigers, we were writing applications for funding and things on a one finger at a time kind of typewriter. But one of the young people who was a beneficiary of Lambeth Tigers as it was then now runs Lambeth Tigers, and I'm really ecstatic by the fact that they've got sponsorships, they've got funding, they've got staff, they've got hundreds of kids. When we first started, I think we had like 50 or 60 kids on a regular basis coming and playing football.
So quite early on, you had a bit of a passion for campaigning or to get out there and change the world around you.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that some of those early experiences of seeing what I thought was people being mistreated and maltreated in terms of policing gave me a real keen sense of duty.
So coming on to the IPP sentence, so you got an initial tariff of 2 years, minimum custodial sentence of 2 years handed down, and of course that ended up being a lot longer. So can you tell us a bit about how this was explained to you at the time, what it felt at the time to receive this sentence?
Well, I remember being stood in the dock in December 2007, and I remember hearing lots and lots of legal jargon, and eventually the judge said, I have no other option but to pass an indeterminate sentence. I'm just like, what? Because I know what indeterminate means, but I was just struggling to understand what it meant in that situation, what it meant at that time. And I heard him mention the words discretionary life, and I'm like, who are you talking about? You're not talking about me. You can't be. And then my barrister, a lady called Christina, came up from London to represent me. And she started to explain that this was a new thing and that she didn't fully understand the ramifications, but she felt that it was manifestly, and I remember those words, manifestly excessive. And I just thought, what's happened? Because originally what the judge said is originally he was going to give me 4 years, but he'd half that, and that would then become my indeterminate sentence. I remember almost feeling devoid of any emotion because at the time I thought, this is some mistake. Surely this is a mistake and it will be rectified in a minute. Now they'll say, no, actually we've got it wrong. You're going to do a couple of years and that'll be the end of it. But nobody gave me an explanation. In fact, it took me 3 years to get an explanation, because I went off to prison and I started to think, have I got to do a minimum of 4 years on this IPP? I then found out it wasn't, that it was 2. And I thought, oh, well, that's good. But then I realized that it was still indeterminate. So it didn't matter whether it was 1, 2, 3, or 5. And as time went on, I started to realize that actually, if I'd have had a bigger tariff, I would have had a better opportunity of getting through the system a lot quicker than I did. The other thing was that staff in the prison had no idea what it meant. They just knew that people were being locked up with the cell card. It had one of 2 things written on it, depending on what landing you were on and depending on what prison. They either wrote on it 99 years or the word life. I just started to think, this doesn't make sense. This is, I didn't actually, yes, I committed an offence, but I didn't physically injure anybody. Nobody's, bleeding. Nobody's dead. Nobody's, there's none of that aspect to this offence.
And just, I can imagine on top of the stress of the sentence itself and all these hurdles that we'll talk about a bit later, just the lack of clarity, I suppose, that's appalling. Yeah,
it was appalling, but it was also frustrating because one of the things that unfortunately, and not all of them, but some prison staff were very good at, they were good at mocking people who were on IPP, but none of them had the ability to articulate what your sentence actually meant for you, how long it would take you to get through the system, what you needed to do to prove yourself. Because at the time, I had a course prescribed for me, and at the time, there were only 4 prisons in the country running this course. And I was at the time being held in a prison that didn't run it. And I just thought, well, why am I here? Let me go. Send me to where I need to go. And then I had issues with governors along the way. And, I ended up in one particular jail. I never forget it. It was horrible. There were about 400 prisoners there. Only 23 of them at the time were people of colour. And there was a lot of inequality and a lot of outright racism. Wow. And so I challenged them. As I do, and I found myself quickly removed. I was put on a bus and removed to a jail in Wiltshire, where I spent the next 4 years.
Oh, that's awful. And if I understand correctly, so one of the big issues with IPPs is they place all of this importance on the individual to pass these courses, to demonstrate at the next Parole Board meeting that they're able to pass a risk assessment, but that they can't actually access the courses or any of the means to do what they've been asked to do. I've heard that there are also waiting lists that are longer than the tarriffs, completely ridiculous scenarios of that. Is that right?
It's absolutely spot on. I met one guy who was a really nice guy, actually, but I met this one guy and he really started to put into perspective what IPP meant for me, because he explained that his tariff was 12 months and the course he needed to do had a waiting list, minimum waiting list of 5 years. And I just thought, so that means, with the time that you've got to wait, you've got to get onto it. And once you get onto it, you have to have a post-course review. And then eventually, after you've served, the general rule of thumb, although it's not strictly, always the case, is that if you do more than sort of 5, 6 years in prison on a long-term sentence, you're going to have to go to open prison. So, in my head, I'm calculating, I'm thinking, so this guy's going to do at least 8 or 9 years before he moves on. And then I found out for me that the waiting list was quite long. I can't remember what it was at the time, but fortunately for me, and it was fortunate, although they kept messing about, I was sat in this jail waiting and I saw people coming and going after me, parachuted in, doing the course, and then getting transferred back to the prisons where they'd come from. My MP at the time, we were friendly. I wouldn't say we were friends, but we were friendly because I'd met him. He's no longer the MP, but he decided to come and visit me while he was still a sitting MP. He then went and spoke to the governor, and then very shortly after that, he made representations to the Secretary of State at the time, say, look, what's going on? And the Secretary of State wrote that if I wasn't on the next course, I would most certainly be on the one after that. So that was a guarantee in my mind, a written guarantee that if I don't get on the next one, I'm going to be on the one after that. And lo and behold, I was on that one afterwards. But then there were other things that happened that I didn't understand, because while I was on the course, I became the first at this particular prison, the first person to be asked to be a mentor to other people doing the course. And then they only recommended that I go to open conditions where other people who I mentored on the course were recommended for release. And I never did understand that, because it infuriated me, because I'm just thinking, well, hang on a minute, you've asked me, there's nobody else who's been a mentor, so you've obviously spotted something in me to ask me to do that. And for some reason, your staff team are not unified in their recommendations, because some people have been, and don't get me wrong, I mean, I never felt bitter towards the individuals. I just felt bitter towards the system. System really does seem to, really mess with people's lives.
When you sort of say the system, was it just that whoever was passing on these things to you or asking you to be a mentor or making these decisions, that there just wasn't any communication, or was there just no transparency between departments? What was going on there? Or do you still not know?
I still don't know. Still don't know. And I've distanced myself from it as much as I can, because at this point I'm just like, well, you know what, I've moved on. But I think that there was just a lack of communication. Somebody somewhere, there was a guy who was the head psychologist signing off on everything that staff did, but he went off long-term sick because, he couldn't cope. A lot of stuff going on. Somebody else stepped into his shoes. It was a mess. I just felt at a point that I didn't care where I lived or died at that moment.
Oh, really?
I felt like I had to do what I needed to do, and I was going to do it regardless of what I was told. Don't get me wrong, there was fear at times, because, obviously there are more of them than there are of me. I don't want to get into the kind of the them and us culture, because reality is, all I had was me. And I just felt that what was happening was wrong. And guess what? Some people seem to agree, because the Justice Select Committee has just released a report 10 years after the repeal of IPP, essentially saying exactly that it's wrong. And see, this is one of the difficulties I have with the criminal justice system, is that not only does it make it hard to do the right thing, but when it's realized that a mistake has been made, it's really incredibly slow to correct itself, because, politicians effectively are not willing. Let's put it bluntly. If it's not a vote winner, it's not a priority. And I just think that's sad, because for me, there are 10.9 billion reasons why some of this stuff is important. And that's because that is the figure that it costs our economy in reoffending each year. And I just think that if you genuinely want to reduce reoffending, then you'll do the things that are so obvious to be done. And one of those things really is reversing the scourge, the horrific nature of IPP.
Yeah, absolutely. What is the psychological impact of an IPP on someone who's been given a sentence like that? And also, how does that affect their outlook going forward, their outlook for the future? Because that's going to have some bearing on how they're going to approach their parole meetings and so on.
Yeah. Do you know what? It'd be unfair of me to name him, so I won't name him, but there was one chap who felt that he was never getting out of prison. And as a result, he never did, because he took his life in 2010. And I didn't do it easily, but I remember thinking, I never thought for a second that he would take his life, but I did know that something was wrong. And I did something at that time that I haven't done before or since. I went to the authorities to say, look, you really need to keep an eye on this guy. And they ignored me. And I think it was less than 2 weeks after that initial suggestion from me that, you need to keep an eye on him, he was dead. And I just find that unforgivable. Yeah. But then the other thing is that in custody, but also out of custody, you feel like you're walking on eggshells. While I was in custody, I remember, I hinted earlier on about, staff that would mock you. One of the things that some staff, not all of them, but a lot of staff were very good at, is knowing that you had to toe the line. So you couldn't, most people wouldn't want to be seen to be difficult. You didn't want to complain even if you'd been wronged. You didn't want to put in written complaints. You didn't want to write to MP. I mean, I did that stuff all day, every day. I really didn't care. But a lot of people wouldn't do it. I felt like I was treading on eggshells. I was no different to anybody else. I think the only thing is, at that point, I reached this point where I just felt like this is wrong, and I can't be complicit in my own demise, effectively. I can't. Even post-release, I speak to people on a regular basis even now, and I know what they're saying and I know what they're feeling, because I still feel it. I feel like I'm on eggshells, because it's that sense of just suspicion that you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing could lead to recall to custody. And I just think that's outrageous, because one of the things that the legal system is built on is certainty. So there should be some certainty around, how you live your life, as long as you're not committing an offence, suspicion should not be enough. But unfortunately, even open prisons operate on the same basis. If somebody in prison, another prisoner, doesn't like you for whatever reason, that's their stuff. But if they put your name in the box, you will be moved to closed conditions while that's investigated. And it will take you 6 months to a year to return to open conditions. And that is just, it's not on. It's not on. Can you imagine if we applied those same systems to Parliament? There'd be no MPs. There'd be no MPs.
I'm trying to think of sort of anywhere where you want, a positive outcome, but that's the atmosphere. You're not going to get that if you're sort of bringing this sort of an atmosphere of suspicion everywhere, or anywhere I've worked before. I cannot imagine why you'd think that would bring out a good outcome.
I mean, I don't know who comes up with this stuff, but somebody somewhere writes some of this policy, and I think whoever it is, they're an idiot. And I think that, it needs to change. At the moment, one of the mantras that's out everywhere is about lived experience. And I would take it more seriously if it was really truly embraced by people all across, government, in the civil service, in politics and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is there are people in positions that tap into lived experience when it suits them, when it means that they don't have to pay for that information to try and do what it is they do, that they're getting paid to do, but they're basically soliciting information from people by their lived experience. And I just think that's it's heinous. It's really out of order. I think that it's a shame that we're not learning. I mean, so I've been really privileged that I very early when I came out of custody, I had conversations with people like Raphael Rowe, who has presented World's Toughest Prisons and has set up a foundation which I'm a trustee of. And he's very keen because, I mean, the difference between us, we both served 12 years in prison. Difference is, as I said to him, is that I was guilty, he wasn't. He just wants to see decent prisons, and he goes to prisons. And I recoil in my seat when I watch some of the prisons that he walks into, because they greet prisoners with a handshake. Now, don't get me wrong. A handshake's not going to, put me to sleep nicely at night. How I'm treated by the system and how I end up emerging from that system is what I'm focused on. But, you look at Finland and Norway and all these other European countries where their prison population is quite low because of the way they treat their prisoners. And it seems to me that, some people in those countries, I don't know, I've never been to Norway or Finland, but in some of these jurisdictions, criminality is only on the basis of necessity. I think, unfortunately, in this country, somebody somewhere thinks it's necessary to lock up, double the amount of people that we locked up since the 1990s. I think under Michael Howard, it was something like 40,000 people in prison. Now it's kind of teetering around the 90,000 plus mark. And you just wonder why, I think that there are so many things that we could do differently. Whether or not they will be achieved in my lifetime, I don't know. I think that's speculative at best. But lived experience voices will be heard, and that we can improve. I mean, it sounds very airy-fairy. It's almost like, one of these kind of competitions where they say, what do you want to see? And somebody says, world peace. That's not what I'm after. I mean, yes, world peace would be wonderful, but I'm just kind of in this space of, let's just create a sensible, decent system that actually brings people who may have been, in a difficult bind to a place of not wanting to reoffend, because actually the quality of their life is not so bad outside of prison. And having had an experience of prison, it's still a deterrent, but it doesn't have to be Dickensian. Prison is the punishment. You don't have to then strip people of their entire dignity in order to try and get them to rehabilitate, because actually it doesn't work that way. In fact, it makes very bitter people even more bitter.
Yeah, I was sort of going to ask about your thoughts about sort of prison as a space of quote unquote rehabilitation. Are there any other sort of key issues or key barriers within prisons that you think prevent that?
Yes. Again, see, it comes down to staff, I think. And when I say staff, I'm talking about senior leadership as well as, the rank and file, probably more the senior leadership, because I remember having a conversation with a governor once, and this governor, when I spoke to him about release on temporary license, or ROTL as it's called, there were two avenues that we had this conversation. One, I just said to him, look, I need to speak to you about my home leave, and I was very keen to get home leave to see my mum and what have you. And he said, why are you talking to me? And I said, because your name's on, your name gets signed on all of these documents. So I've come to the head honcho. And he kind of mulled on it a little while. He's no longer a prison governor. He's moved on to do other things. But it was just that attitude of, why are you talking to me? And I just thought, oh. But then I spoke to one of his subordinates, another governor, but a slightly junior governor. And one of the things he said was, my mortgage depends on me wielding my pen to sign off somebody's ROTL. And I just thought, see, the trouble with that is that you can be choosy. You could be an undercover racist for all anybody knows, and decide, well, I'm going to sign this one, but I'm not going to sign that one. It's not the job for you if you're not willing to say, right, okay, I'm going to, because the thing is, if you sign off a ROTL, you're signing on the basis that somebody coming to an open prison has been deemed safe to be there. So actually, your mortgage doesn't depend on it. The mortgage of your boss depends on it, because he's the one that, is responsible for everything that comes through prison. I mean, me personally, and I know there's people that would probably really dislike me for saying this, but me personally, if I had the ability to, I'd do away with open prison. I would do away with it because I think that it's harmful. I think that there are people there who are not doing a good job, that are holding people back from achieving, really positive outcomes, building social capital that they can come out to the community with, driving licenses, education, jobs, accommodation, relationships, all that sort of stuff, I think is impeded by open prison, because I think open prison, it's not a healthy environment. At the moment, here's the reality. There are jails up and down this country that are unsafe for both prisoners and staff. Open prisons are not unsafe, and you won't see very many incidences, but they are holding staff who could be in those BCAT and CCAT prisons, making them safer places.
Right, interesting. It's interesting that you had that reflection on open prisons, because I think I listened to an interview once where before going to an open prison, you sort of assumed it would be sort of land of milk and honey, I think you sort of called it. Is that right?
Yeah.
So not quite.
Well, no, it's not. And I suppose that's just my experience. I mean, when I first heard about open prison, somebody said to me, they said, are you going to DCAT? And I said, what's DCAT? And when he explained to me what a DCAT was, I was like, really? There's such a thing? And I was excited. And that's where the whole land of milk and honey thing came. But when I got to open prison, I was quickly disabused of the idea that I was going to achieve very much. I didn't achieve anything in open prison, apart from a certificate of higher education in law. And even that was hard won, because when I initially started to go down this route of reading some law, I applied in one prison, and it took me 9 months to get permission to do it. And then eventually they said, oh, we're going to move you. And by the time when they moved me, that permission then disappeared with the move, because I had to reapply at the new prison. See what I mean? So I got so frustrated, I just thought to myself, you know what, this is not worth it.
Yeah, it's just shocking when you sort of think about it, isn't it? You mentioned, or sort of hinted at earlier, that prison reform wasn't really much of a vote winner. What are the main barriers, do you think, to prison reform in this country? Is it public perception, or what do you think?
I think it is public perception, but I think it's more... Well, actually, no, it's a combination of the two. It's public perception, because I think at any one time, I think the figure is something like 0.01% of the population is in prison at any one time. So the reality is most people don't know and don't care what goes on. But there's also this assumption from people that everybody in prison is a murderer or a rapist, and that couldn't be further from the truth. But that's the picture, unfortunately, that politicians and media and whoever else cares to get involved in that space tries to paint. And I think it's unfortunate, because actually I've met some wonderful people in prison. I've met some really decent people who unfortunately just fallen they've fallen through the cracks. And reoffending, unfortunately, was an option, or the only option. There's a massive there's too much in the hands of politicians when it comes to the criminal justice system.
IPPs were created under New Labour's Criminal Justice Act, a wide-ranging raft of legislation and part of their aim to get tough on crime. Labour's then Home Secretary was David Blunkett, now Lord Blunkett, and the man most responsible for IPPs. He thought that these sentences, severe as they were, would be used in the most extreme circumstances only, a few hundred at most. In reality, IPPs became widespread from the moment they were introduced in 2005, with several thousand inmates being detained indefinitely in such a manner. So Ken Clarke, the man who abolished these sentences in 2012, I think since said that it was absurd that people were still serving IPPs to this day, after he'd abolished them. And I wanted to know some of your thoughts about that, and maybe why he couldn't have done more when he was in power.
Wow, yeah, that's a big question. I think that and see, this is the problem, is it's going to be speculation, but I think that he had his wings clipped, because the thing is, at the time, I remember him saying that he wanted to kind of deal with the IPP situation. I remember speaking to an MP in prison who got elected to the Conservative government. So she became a Conservative MP, became a member of the government as a junior minister, and promised that there was going to be an overhaul and a root and branch reform and a review of IPP. And then all of a sudden, Ken Clarke was removed from his position. I think, sadly, we can speculate. The only person that can remove somebody from their position like that is going to be the Prime Minister. So, I suspect that, again, it comes back to the whole not being a vote winner type stuff. I think one of the scandals of IPP has been the turnover of the amount of justice secretaries that have come in and gone out in the lifetime of IPP, because no one has truly got to grips with it. No one has truly committed to changing it. Some of us who were serving IPP, when we put the world to rights, in ourselves at night time, we had conversations about whether, if it was decided that we couldn't have any compensation, and by the way, I haven't had any, but if we couldn't have any compensation, but we could have our sentences commuted to determinate sentences to allow, for any potential claims, would we go for it? And everybody, was a resounding yes, you'd go for it, So in other words, if you'd served 10 years, you could just have your sentence changed to a 20-year standard sentence and be off with you. But for some reason, I don't know, there just seems to be a real reluctance, and I don't understand it. People are unfortunately taking their lives in custody. People are becoming very mentally unstable and unwell. People are turning to substances and, abuse of substances in custody that they're all too reliant on. And so, I just wonder, it just feels so, there seems to be a wanton disregard for life. Yeah. And that's such a shame, because one of the things, I met a guy actually in one of the prisons I was in, and I loved what he said to me. He was from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And he said to me, the best way that you can judge a country is by the way it treats its prisoners. And I thought that is a fantastic, way to frame things, to look at things. Because when you look at all the regimes around the world, and Raphael Rowe helps us to do that quite well with the Netflix series and all of his predecessors before him, the UK doesn't have a very good record of treating its prisoners very well. I don't think. Don't get me wrong, there's going to be lots of other examples. I don't suppose Guantanamo Bay comes into the equation because it's not officially a prison as such, but I just think it's horrific, really, if we're talking about, helping people to get on with their lives. We're talking about, reducing reoffending, reducing the cost of reoffending, reducing the carnage and the wreckage of, people's past that leads them to reoffending, then it makes real sense to begin with freeing up some space. There's at least 2,000 people still serving IPP at the moment, as well as, and let's not forget the two strike lifers whose legislation doesn't even exist anymore. Just much like the IPP, some of these guys are 20 years over tarriffs.
Mm. Another famous campaigner against IPP sentences is, of course, David Blunkett, who I understand you've met. Is that right?
I didn't meet him. I had a conversation with him like we're having now. So I had a Zoom conversation because we couldn't meet in person because at that time there were still lots of COVID regulations and it just wasn't practical.
I was wondering, what it would have been like to chat to a man whose policies have had, quite an impact on your life. And I wondered as well, seeing as he's now campaigning so much against IPP, why wasn't this foreseen at the time?
Do you know, we didn't really get into the nuts and bolts of all of that. He did express deep regret, and I know that he's on record previously to speaking to me, expressing that regret. But I think what it was is that because he did what he did say is that he thought it was going to be for like literally a few hundred people, no more than about 1,000 people, I think, was what he said. And then ultimately he ended up being kind of 10, 11, 12,000, something like that. So, 11 times more than was anticipated. But I think there were a couple of things, and this is just me reading between the lines, and that is that he didn't anticipate that the judges would be as frivolous as they were in handing them out. Because the other thing is that there were huge bottlenecks because nobody started to think, well, actually, the machinations of this is that people have to prove themselves to the parole board. I don't think anybody thought beyond that. I remember the judge saying to me, actually, that the parole board would decide. But I don't think he really read very much into the fact that I'd have to go through, like everybody else, this process of trying to get a place on a program that was like gold dust. And so, I mean, it's sad and it's difficult. I'm glad I was able to speak to David Blunkett with, decorum and respect, because I was very angry before I spoke to him, and I wanted to really challenge and confront him. But in the end, we had a decent conversation. I was quite appreciative that he was willing to talk. But actually, I had to nudge him into speaking to me, because originally I wrote to him and he was reluctant to begin with. He said he was speaking to lots and lots of people, and I had to sadly say, well, unfortunately, black voices, people of colour in this situation are not being heard. And based on that, he I think felt guilty and decided to speak to me. A bit manipulative on my part, but it's a shame that you have to go there in order to get people to to talk to you, especially after the impact that they've had on your life.
Yeah, IPP, as well as sort of lots of the criminal justice system, does disproportionately affect people of colour, right? So it's important that someone like David Blunkett does confront that. So
absolutely. He told me that one of his colleagues, David Lammy, was going to be kind of taking up the mantle. I don't know if that's still the case, because at the time David Lammy was the shadow justice secretary. I don't know if that is still the position, but I haven't had a chance to have a conversation with David Lammy as yet. I have met him very, 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 very briefly. But I'm planning to be in contact at some point soon when I've got a bit more to kind of go at him with.
We're going to be coming on to some of the sort of many things that you seem to be doing an awful lot at the minute, so we'll get a bit of chance to talk about that, including one of the things I think you said is that you want to be the first former inmate to run a prison yourself. Is that correct?
I'll be honest with you. I'd love to do that, but I've had an experience recently that tells me that it may not happen. I'm in the civil service at the moment. I do a role in the civil service, and I applied for a promotion. I was offered the job, and then it was subsequently withdrawn. I'm going to go back to the drawing board on that, because if that opportunity has been taken away, I suspect that there'll be a reluctance to allow anything seeming like an ex-offender governing the prison. But the reality is that not just me. I know that there's lots of people. I mean, people like Gethin Jones, again, somebody I've never met, but I know lots about. People like David Breakspear. All these kinds of people I know would be amazing prison governors, because they have the same lived experience as me, and they have ideas that would not only reduce reoffending, but would create a kind of an environment that people wouldn't necessarily want to come back to, but people would be very respectful of. I think one of the things is that the more antagonistic a system is to somebody, It's like, I think it was Lord Wolfe that said it, if you treat people like animals, then don't be surprised if you get bitten. It's that kind of sense of doing things. And, I'm not saying I have all the answers, because I don't. I think that would be foolish and naive. But I have some of the answers. And unfortunately, the people that are in positions of authority, that are in position to affect change, either, don't know it or just don't care. They don't really give the answers, which just tells me that this is, rather than a system of default, it's a system of design.
I mean, if you were to become a prison governor, what are some of the reforms that you might like to see change?
I think, we started to go down this route, and I think it was, if I remember right, I think it might have been Ken Clarke who started it, but he was giving governors more autonomy. So we had these kind of almost, you remember when we had these super head teachers in schools? It was almost that same kind of premise, that you have an autonomous governor who controlled and managed what they did in their prison, but it never really took off. And I think that needs to happen. But carefully, because otherwise, you're at risk of having dictators, effective dictators in small environments. But if I had the ability, one of the things I would want to do is get rid of prison service instructions, because I think that they're quite long, they're laborious, and all they tend to do is they allow governors and the system to continue to keep on masses of control measures on people who are already subjugated by their very imprisonment. So I think I'd get rid of those. I think that one of the things I'd want to do if I had control over prisons, I'd say, look, this is what I'm doing here. If you want to come to this prison and do things slightly differently, you apply to do that, but you apply to do so on this basis. And that basis would be that one, PSI doesn't exist here. We're going to respect one another. We're going to respect the reasons that you're here, but we're going to work to ensure that when you leave here, you're better off than when you came here. That would be me. That would be effectively me. But if I had the control of the whole system, as I say, one of the things I would definitely do is get rid of open prison. I'd get rid of it. But the other thing is that it's not always practical, but I'd want to try and get the prison population down to 1990 levels. I don't see why it's so big. You can't, you have to balance it, because you can't send the message that actually you can commit offences and you won't go to prison just because it's this offence or that offence. That is a nonsense. I think prison has to be a deterrent, but people have to be in a position to leave better than when they went in, because if they're not going to leave better than when they went in, then they're just going to keep going on that cycle of recidivism and not really care.
I think one of the things that's interesting, so you're a trustee with the Raphael Rowe Foundation. And I thought it was interesting, there's a sort of emphasis on reform outside of prison walls as well as within. And I wondered did you have any sort of thoughts on that sort of work? What could be done sort of outside of prisons themselves?
Yeah, I think it starts with, because one of the things the Prison Reform Trust did very well was they have written a number of reports and identified in the main that there are three main ingredients that help people to stop reoffending: good relationships, accommodation, and gainful employment. Because the thing is, one of the reasons that here we have there's not many, but the idea was there are going to be 1,000 people in the civil service with lived experience of the criminal justice system by the end of 2023. That was the plan. Whether it's still going to plan, I don't know. But the idea behind that was that somebody decided somewhere, and I wrote a letter about this some years ago, so it was nice to see that it actually came to fruition, is that if the government is asking employers to take people on, then the government itself needs to lead by example and do exactly the same thing. So, it's great that they're doing that. Yes, a lot of the positions are quite sort of entry-level type things, and it's difficult to see whether or not there is a career progression. I'm case in point. But I think that's where we need to be. We need to be in that place of really opening things up. Okay, one of the things I was saying to people when I spoke to, I can't remember who it was, but I spoke to them, is no one is in their right mind going to advocate, just for example, that a sex offender should go and work in a school. That's nonsense. Nobody's saying that. However, there are, I think, opportunities for people who may have committed some violent crimes, not necessarily serious ones, but who have truly shown that they can be different, that they can be pro-social in the community, to be given an opportunity to do stuff and to impart some wisdom and knowledge on young people to prevent them repeating the same mistakes. One of the things that I don't do, I wouldn't say to a young person, for example, don't smoke weed. I would just share the experience that I smoked it and this is why I don't smoke it anymore. Because I've been down that road. It wasn't for me, but it would be foolish of me to say, well, you shouldn't do this, because the thing is, I did it. So how can I tell somebody not to do it? All I can say is, look, I did it. This is what it did for me. And that experience is something that I don't want to repeat. I think that's where we need to be. We can't keep having this top-down kind of do as I say, not as I do attitude with anybody, never mind young people, because they won't have it. There's a generation coming now that is having no nonsense from anybody. I think we saw some of that during the London riots, but anyway, that's another matter. We saw it during the lockdown as well. People were coming together and saying, look, enough of this.
Yeah, so you've got quite a few different hats at the minute. Wondered if you wanted to chat a little bit about some of the different projects that you're kind of involved in and some of the work that you're doing these days. If you want to sort of talk about some of the stuff that you're up to.
I'm trying to slow down at the moment. But as you know, I'm obviously part of Raphael's Foundation. I'm a trustee of something called the Charles Gordon Trust, which is very specific to kind of Croydon and Lewisham, that kind of part of London, doing some stuff with young people and housing and that kind of thing. But I'm not as involved in that as I once was. I co-founded a political party while I was still in prison, which is doing exceptionally well. Again, I'm not very hands-on with it at the moment. I'm not as involved with it as I once was, because one of the things about politics is it can be very toxic. And so I've dressed back a little bit just to kind of get my bearings to see where I want to go, because although I've been part of setting up a political party, I don't know that it's going in the direction that I want to go in as an individual. So instead, I've kind of fallen back to be more involved in campaigning around stuff like IPP. So in that sense, I am, what I am doing is campaigning around IPP at the moment. I am studying, I'm working, and that's kind of about it, really. I've really slowed down. I mean, one of the things I do...
Oh, that's all.
One of the things I do enjoy doing, but I just don't have enough time at the moment, is when I co-founded the political party, we had some election stuff going on earlier this year, and I was invited to a radio station called Love the Beat Radio, based in Southeast London. And there's a program on there called Sound Mind Show. And they invited somebody without a sound mind. And I stayed. But so they invited me up. I spoke about taking the Initiative Party, which is the organisation I co-founded. They just asked me if I'd stay. So I was appearing on this show every Wednesday evening or whatever. Yes, every Wednesday evening. But again, I've had to slow down on that, but they're fantastic. So there's a group of 4 of us, if you include me, and we just talk about topics from the week for a couple of hours, bit of music, and that's it. Jobs are good, but again, it's a lot of time and energy and
all these different sort of projects going on. I don't know if this is even silly to ask, but I was going to ask you finally, what is next for you?
So now I'm aiming to set up an organisation. It's kind of it's in the background. It's happening slowly. And that organisation is going to be very focused around campaign issues, particularly around criminal justice, housing, education. But the other thing is that, so this organisation, I've got a couple of my friends, colleagues and friends who want to be involved in some capacity, and 2 of them are going to be trustees along with myself. And one of the things I was concerned about is that when I came out of prison, I had 3 particular labels. One is that I'm an ex-veteran, or I'm a veteran. I was an ex-reservist with the TA as it was then, but now the Army Reserve. I'm an addict, alcoholic, but in recovery. I've been in recovery for 16 years now. And the other thing was that I was an ex-offender coming out, and there was no one organisation that was able to help me with anything. The Royal British Legion and some of the military charities were fantastic. Outside of that, there was no organisation to kind of help me to go here, there, or wherever. I had to literally sit in front of a laptop, find some Wi-Fi, and find what I needed. So I want to set up this organisation called New Wave. And New Wave is going to kind of campaign around some issues, we're going to have some uncomfortable conversations, and we're going to try and bring some people along with us to have those uncomfortable conversations. That's probably the next thing. And to carry on with my studies, to finish off the law degree that I started all those years ago and didn't manage to finish in open prison.
Amazing. Well, Andrew Morris, thank you so much for coming on the Rebel Justice podcast. Wish you all the very best of luck with everything that you're getting on with in the future. I'm sure we'll speak to you again very soon.
Thank you so much.
Despite having been abolished in 2012, by not retrospectively undoing any existing IPPs still in place, thousands of prisoners are still being detained under IPP sentences to this day. As of June 2022, there were 8,576 IPPs still ongoing, 10 whole years after the sentences were abolished. The fight for justice goes on, with several campaign groups organising to put pressure on the government to address this oversight. But with no official position as yet, the future remains uncertain. This has been The View magazine's Rebel Justice podcast. Join us next time for more interviews and discussion about justice, creativity, and building a better world. And for more in-depth articles and features, you can also head to our online magazine at theviewmag.org.uk, or get the latest by following us on Twitter at rebel_justice, or our Instagram at _the_view_magazines.